This video connects up with pages 12, 13, and 14 in your notes handout. So let's look at the top of the 13th. The dynamic that we have in England in the 17th century is that the Stuart royal family in England wants to establish an absolute monarchy, and Parliament, dominated by the House of Commons and the middle class, the English middle class, wants to have a constitutional arrangement. Here you have the original Stuart monarch, James I. He desires to establish an absolute monarchy. He's a wannabe absolute monarch. And here in the portrait, you see all sorts of trappings of absolute monarchy. You've got James I being crowned from on high, the divine right of kings. Why should the monarch, according to the theory of absolute monarchy, hold all sovereignty, political decision-making power? Because God selected them, the divine right of kings. So here you've got that kind of imagery here. He's ruling over all else. He's large and in charge. His reign is going to be peaceful, according to the title of this portrait. His reign is going to be wise, etc. He's in control and above everything else. He's God's lieutenant on earth. This is the type of political dynamic that James I wants to promote as a want-to-be absolute monarch. As you can also see on page 12, here are some of the practices that the Stuart monarchs, starting with James I, are going to put in place. And the reason the middle class is going to be willing to fight a war to attempt and successfully will prevent the Stuart dynasty from establishing an absolute monarchy is because these types of practices would completely zero out the English middle class. Politically, it would obviously zero them out because an absolute monarchy puts all sovereignty, political decision-making power in the hands of one person. But economically as well, if the Stuart dynasty could force the English middle class to hand over their property, to give them money whenever they want, if the Stuart dynasty royal family could set up monopolies, business monopolies for political allies and themselves, this would mean the end of the middle class. The middle class would get rolled back into an underclass status. So this dynamic means the middle class in England, which is the largest middle class, the wealthiest middle class, the most politically powerful middle class in all of Europe, they're going to be willing to fight and kill and die to prevent the Stuart dynasty from establishing an absolute monarchy. If you take a look at page 13, we have a dynamic with the next English monarch, the next in the line of the Stuart dynasty. After James I was his son, Charles I. And Charles I found himself in a bad position, as you can see there at the top of page 13. He was forced to ask Parliament for money upon losing a war in Scotland. And the English middle class in Parliament says, absolutely, we thought you'd never ask. We would love to give you some of our money. All you have to do is sign this. This being the petition of right, the stipulations of which you have on your page 13 there. Remember, the English middle class, they want to pay taxes. They want to give money to the government in exchange for a shared sovereignty arrangement. They want to pay taxes in order to have a legitimate line to be at the decision-making table. So, the petition of right has two stipulations. People only have to pay loans and taxes approved by the Parliament, so this would be a shared sovereignty arrangement. And no one could be imprisoned without due process. This would enshrine civil liberties and rights. So the petition of right is very much in keeping with some of the major stipulations of constitutional governance. It establishes a shared sovereignty arrangement. The sovereignty would be shared between the monarchy. The political decision-making power would be shared between the monarchy and the House of Commons. The House of Commons dominated by the English middle class. It would create a limited government. The government would not be all-powerful. It would enshrine civil liberties and rights instead of the monarch being able to determine the fate of people and just locking them up and throwing away the key. And it would impose the rule of law. Instead of the law being under an absolute monarchy, whatever the monarch says on that given day, it would establish a rule of written law determined in a shared sovereignty arrangement. So with that, let's take a look at page 14. Ultimately, this is going to get this political power rivalry and these differing visions about how power should be organized in England going forward is going to play out on the battlefield. And take a look at page 14, and you can see things do not go well for Charles I and the Stuart monarchy here. But before we get to that, on the top of page 14, this is ultimately going to get decided in the English Civil War. Let's just read briefly this little paragraph here at the top. After his first major confrontation with Parliament, Charles I tried to rule England without Parliament and ignored the Petition of Right. So he signed the Petition of Right initially. He took their money, the money of the English middle class, but then he went back on the deal and he just took their money. Eventually, Charles I dismissed Parliament and their claims to power altogether, and he sought to rule as a full, absolute monarch. This set off the English Civil War. So he had signed the Petition of Right, he had taken their money, he had double-crossed them, he took their money and then dissolved Parliament and said they didn't have a legitimate claim to sovereignty, political power. The second paragraph there on page 14, the war pitted two sides against one another. The Cavaliers were on the side of the Stuart monarchy, versus the Roundheads. Those are the forces of Parliament and the middle class. The Roundheads win the English Civil War. Circle that on your page. Make sure you put a check mark by the Roundheads. The English middle class wins the Civil War. So make sure you have that clear on page 14. Upon winning the English Civil War, the middle class, they capture Charles I on the battlefield. They win the English Civil War, which takes place over a bulk of the 1640s in England, in the middle of the 17th century there. The question at the bottom of this, the third paragraph there, the question in the third paragraph, what motivations and goals led the forces of Parliament after winning the English Civil War to kill King Charles I? What would be the legal justification for such an act? So a little bit more background here. They put Charles I on trial for treason. They have a trial, a jury trial. They find him guilty, and the punishment for his guilty verdict for the crime he committed is the death sentence. And ultimately, they commit an act of regicide, meaning they kill the monarch. They cut Charles I's head off here in a public execution. And in case this is unclear, here's the executioner, here's the blood-stained axe, here's Charles I's head, and here's his body. Why would they execute Charles I? Well, Charles I, the middle class, they're trying to establish constitutionalism. What constitutionalism says is nobody is above the law. The law is applicable to everybody. So if anybody breaks the law, whether it be Charles the monarch or a member of Parliament or whatever, everyone is beneath the law. The law applies to all equally. So in this case, you've got the middle class. They want to establish constitutionalism. They want to establish the rule of law that applies to everybody. So they're seeking to establish constitutionalism and the rule of law. Charles I broke the law. He was found guilty of breaking the law. The law applies to everybody. And the punishment for breaking the law, he was charged with treason, which basically means like a betrayal of your society. And the commonplace punishment for treason historically is the death penalty. So he's found guilty of breaking the law. The punishment is death. And in doing so, the English middle class is brutally establishing a constitutional setting. Kind of the first major introduction to constitutionalism in human history here is an execution. It says, no one is above the law. The rule of law applies to all.